right, Alan, we are live. It's awesome to have you back. I think of you. I was actually just out your way in Santa Cruz, and I almost reached out if I had time to do the 2.5. It looked like 2.5 hour drive up. I would have, but unfortunately I didn't. But I always think of you on my cross country flights because I'm reminded that the pretzel saved my life. But thank you for taking the time. I've been diving into your new book for people listening.
Uh,
It's Can Fasting Save Your Life, which I know you have been working on for many years. So congrats on the new book.
Thank you. Yes, we're very proud of the book. It's the culmination of the integration of the 22 papers we've published in the peer-reviewed literature and the 40 years of experience we've had fasting 25,000 people. So it gives people the information they need to know to understand fasting. And it also has the information their doctors need to know to help them get through a process safely and effectively.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I have a bunch of questions in the book that I will get to, but I am curious. We talked last January of 2023. I know you were working on the book, but I remember I went back and listened to our episode. I know you were working on at least 5 different papers that you were hoping to get published. One, I recall you were looking at the effects of doing annual or biannual, I think it was 7-day fasts on healthy people.
Yes.
I'd love to just kind of get into like the past 2 years of what you've been doing since.
So we actually did an interesting study where we recruited metabolically healthy people. These are younger people that don't have high blood pressure, diabetes, autoimmune disease, cancer, and that are not overweight.
Hmm.
And what we found was it was exceedingly difficult to recruit people or find people that are actually healthy. A lot of
Hmm.
people thought they were healthy. Maybe they weren't overweight, but their blood pressure was too high or their blood sugar was too high, or they had other biomarkers that suggested they weren't ideally healthy. We finally got so desperate that we started recruiting people from the staff of the TrueNorth Health Center. And there we were able to find people that were actually healthy, that met all the parameters. But what was interesting is we took these healthy people who had normal blood pressure, normal weight, and we fasted them around a week. And then we followed those biomarkers to see what kind of changes occurred. And what was fascinating was that as big of a change as we're used to seeing in sick people, proportionally, the changes on cardiometabolic risk factors was actually higher in healthier people than sick people. In other words, the people that get the most benefit of fasting may actually be the young, healthy people that are doing it preventatively, rather than just the older people that are sick and desperate. They started off with normal blood pressure, but their blood pressure actually improved towards health even more so. Their weights, abdominal circumference. So even people that are not sick seem to benefit from this rebooting effect that fasting seems to have. And we know that the changes appear to be cumulative, that the enzymatic changes, for example, detoxifying enzyme systems or glycogen mobilizing enzyme systems, they don't just increase during fasting, they persist in the days, the weeks, and the months after fasting. And every time somebody fasts, it seems to have additional compounding benefit. We've seen that clinically, but it's nice to start seeing objective biomarkers that are supporting our clinical observations. And it may be one of the reasons why what's become so popular, which is intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding, may actually have some of the benefits that people have been experiencing, which is that even if you're just fasting 12 to 16 hours every day, by not eating, say, for 3 to 4 hours before you go to bed at night, which we've been advocating for 40 years, that little bit of fasting kicks in changes. It's not huge changes like you see with long-term fasting, but that little bit day after week after month cumulatively is thought to have some significant clinical benefit. And we've also noticed that people that are doing that have a much easier time fasting because
Hmm.
probably they've already kind of greased the wheel, so to speak, and kicked in a lot of those enzyme systems. So when they go on the longer fast, they don't seem to have the difficulties making the transition as much so as maybe a person who's never skipped a meal in their life.
Right.
So we do think that this intermittent fasting, this time-restricted feeding may have significant utilities, including for healthy people.
Yeah. Is it your, I mean, maybe you can't say this for sure, but with healthy people, is it just because kind of the cleanup process is shorter? they get into those healing states faster because there's really just less work for the body to do.
No question.
Yeah,
These fasts are usually 5 to 10 days. They're not the 20, 30, 40-day fast that we're doing in sicker people. It
right.
doesn't seem to take very long to get them in and get them to a period of stability. The way we kind of judge it clinically is if a person's in the fast and they're having miserable symptoms, we usually keep going until those problems resolve. But for a healthy person, often they don't have any miserable symptoms. And if they're stable at a week, then we move back to healthy eating and get them back to exercising and doing all the things you need to do to stay healthy. But I do think that, and I can tell you myself personally, I'm 65 years old. I've been doing this since I was a 16-year-old teenager. I've never smoked a cigarette or had alcohol or had a cup of coffee or done any of that. So I never had the bad habits to begin with. Been on a vegan diet since I was 16. But even in my own experience, that week of fasting has a really profound effect. And so, as much as I don't like fasting because you have to rest and you can't play basketball or have any fun, the fact is it has a profound effect on how you feel about yourself, the world around you. It really does impact you. And there may be a reason why the Jews and the Jains and the Hindus, the Muslims, the Christians, the Buddhists don't all agree on everything, but they do all seem to agree on fasting. They have a deep respect for the effect of fasting, every major religion, and probably because of some of these changes that people experience, even if they don't have, you know, symptoms of disease.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I enjoyed that part of the book, the little history breakdown of fasting. It was really cool. I have a follow-up question on intermittent fasting because I believe it was Michael Greger's book, How Not to Age, where he definitely encouraged people to do their fasting window on the second half, or on the second half of the day, as opposed to what I have done for many years, which is skip breakfast, and I don't typically eat until 1, 2 o'clock. Have you seen any, whether it's clinically or seen any research beyond that in terms of like which window holds more benefit, or if it matters?
Right. We don't know. I don't think there's enough research to know how much difference it makes. What we do know, though, is that not eating 3 to 4 hours before you go to bed seems to be one of the critical benefits. And it makes sense because you don't want to be storing the fuel you're not burning as fat. You don't want to be disrupting your sleep quality. You don't want to have people waking up trying to empty their bladder. So not eating 3 to 4 hours before you go to bed means you're going to get a 12-hour window. And if you are trying to lose weight and you want to extend that to a 16-hour window, delaying breakfast until you have a chance to do some exercise makes some sense. There's some evidence that exercising in that 12-hour fasting window may preferentially burn fat. So, help mobilize fat. So the idea being not eating before you go to bed is probably the critical issue, not
Mhm.
avoiding that late night eating. And then, if you want to extend the window, it might make more sense to delay breakfast where people have, from a practical standpoint, probably a little easier. Now, biologically, I don't know that how much difference it'll actually make. I see people doing kind of both ends of the window. They all seem to get benefits. So,
Yeah. Yeah, anything is better than nothing, of course. You touched briefly, and we talked a little bit about in our previous conversation, visceral fat, and I at the time really knew nothing about it. But over the past 2 years, in sort of my performance world and sort of the longevity space that's become kind of sexy, if you will, everybody's doing DEXA scans now, and you have been talking about this many, many years.
yes. Well, we
And
actually did a study with a DEXA scanner where we
uh,
looked at body composition changes in fasting. And I'll give you an example. We published one paper that looked at fasting. This happened to be in males. And, they would, on an average of a couple of weeks of fasting, they would lose about 10% of their total body weight. But they
mhm,
lost 20% of their total fat, and amazingly, 40% of their total visceral fat load. They lost 6% of lean tissue, but by the end of 6 weeks follow-up, all of that lean tissue had been replenished. And as a percentage of their body, lean mass was actually a higher percentage at follow-up than it was before fasting. But the
mhm.
fat loss continued. And so now we've got some good 1 year follow-up data showing that not only do people get better fasting, but at least highly motivated people are capable of sustaining whole plant food diets, at least for a year, And the consequences that in that study that we did with our colleague from the Mayo Clinic was they were able to maintain not only weight, but also blood pressure without the need for medication. So I think it is possible for people to make radical diet and lifestyle changes. You just have to have highly motivated people.
Yeah, that's amazing. So what that indicates, right, is that the body, of course, which is smarter than all of us, knows the most dangerous type of fat, the
Right,
threats within the
right.
body, and knows to go after the visceral fat first in a way.
Preferentially. What's
Yeah.
interesting is it's the same thing with tumors. Like when you have a breast tumor and you lose 10% of your body weight fasting, you don't necessarily just lose 10% of the tumor weight. You might lose 50% or all of the tumor because the body
Wow.
in the fasting mode has its own intelligence and it breaks down tissues in inverse proportion to its need. And so your nervous tissue, for example, isn't going to be impacted at all. And your heart muscle isn't going to be impacted unless you're
Right.
in a starvation mode. But the fat, and particularly the visceral fat, seems to be preferential. And it makes sense because it shouldn't be there. Let's
Mm.
face it, what's going on? People overeat because of the pleasure trap. They fool their satiety mechanisms with chemicals that they put in their food like salt, oil, and sugar. They're fool their satiety so they get fat. And about 10% of their fat on average is visceral fat. Visceral fat's the fat that accumulates around the organs, in the belly. And that visceral fat is hypertrophic and hyper metabolic. It acts like a tumor.
Mm.
So, if somebody has 20 pounds of extra weight, they may have 2 pounds of visceral fat. They have a 2 pound abdominal tumor giving off IL-6 and inflammatory markers and all kinds of stuff that's increasing their risk for a variety of different conditions: heart disease, cancer, diabetes, autoimmune disease. And what's fascinating is those conditions that are the leading causes of death and disability are treated as if they're completely independent, unrelated conditions to the point where you have to go to different doctors to even be diagnosed with them. And yet
Mm.
they all have one thing in common, at least, which is they're all associated with the inflammation that's associated with visceral fat. And the fatter you are, the more visceral fat you have, the more vulnerable you are to those diseases. Even infectious diseases like COVID-19. One of the major risk factors for death from COVID-19 was how much visceral fat you have. And
Mm.
yet that wasn't even talked about during the pandemic. Blaming people for being overweight, putting them at risk is politically incorrect. It's blaming the victim. We don't even talk about that. And in fact, people got fatter and fatter during the pandemic instead of thinner, despite their worries. And I think we got a really serious problem. If you don't recognize that being overweight is a significant health problem, it's not just a cosmetic issue. And that a part of that overweight problem is the visceral fat. And that visceral fat needs to be eliminated. And you only have a few ways to do that. You could do really radical things like eat a healthy diet and exercise. And you can also fast, because radical, as you know, comes from radicus, which means root or cause. You have to get rid. You don't take GLP inhibitors, which say, oh yeah, you'll lose some fat, maybe even some visceral fat, and you can keep eating your ultra processed foods that got you into trouble. And that short term you may get benefit, but long term, of course, the gastric motility issues and the cancer and the God knows what is going to be long term. I noticed they're coming out with the class action suits already, where the
Mhm.
lawyers are getting on the TV and getting patients together about all the damaging side effects that they've been experiencing. But the advantage to that is twofold. Number one, those drugs are fabulous to the pharmaceutical industry because you have to take them forever. They're
Mhm.
incredibly expensive and you can never stop. The moment you stop, everything blows up. And you can keep eating your greasy, fatty, slimy, processed, highly ultra processed foods because the idea is to increase satiety so you'll eat the same foods, but you'll eat somewhat less of them.
Mhm.
And so that may be good for short-term weight loss, but I don't think we're going to find it's good for long-term health.
Mhm.
So, right now we have people that are 1 in 8 Americans are taking these medications. So it's a big profit center right now. Interestingly enough, I believe they're made overseas. I think it's Netherlands or France or someplace. Whereas
Okay.
as far as I understand, they don't even use them in that way. They're shipping them over to the US and making it off our system.
Mm. Bananas. I wanna get back to hold that thought because I know you mentioned a study you did in relation to COVID. So I want to get back
Ah,
to that in a little bit, but hold that thought because I have another visceral fat question. Should visceral fat, so for the people that are going out and doing DEXA scans every 6 months or whatever and are monitoring that, in your experience, like what should should it be zero, their visceral fat? And at what point do you look at it and say, okay, you have half a pound or whatever that number is, that it's certainly a real threat?
Yeah. So we don't know because there's not good research looking at
Okay.
that. And our particular studies were done in patients that were overweight.
Hmm.
So in terms of doing DEXA scans, we have limited population that we've looked at. And so it, I think the general thought is there may be some visceral fat that provides mechanical function. You probably find some evidence of that in all people, but the quantities of visceral fat that we have are clearly excessive and associated with pathological processes. So exactly should it be zero or how low is healthy? I think additional research will have to be done to really take a look at that. And of
Yeah.
course, when you do this DEXA scanning, remember you not only need a DEXA scanner, but you need somebody with a specialized software that does body composition.
Right.
And also I know because we did this for 2 years, there's quite a bit of variance in the quality of scanning, the techniques that are used. We had a research grade unit here with software and people that were properly trained to do it. So you might have to take with a grain of kelp some of the results that are coming back because there's quite a bit of variance. There's quite a bit of art to actually getting accurate and reliable data. It's not quite as black and white as they might have you believe.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Yeah, you also mentioned that fat loss continues after fasting. Do you know, I don't know if you've compared this, but is that true only with people that are doing a whole food plant-based diet after the fact, or is that true of anybody that fasts even if they go back to their standard diet?
Well, I think if you go back to a greasy, fatty, processed, ultra-processed food diet, you're likely to get your fat and your visceral fat back without too much trouble. But what I can tell you is when we followed these people at a year, they had not all been 100% compliant with a
Hmm.
whole plant food SOS-free diet, but they had done well enough to maintain their weight loss. So 76% of those had maintained their weight loss at a year. And what was interesting of those, most of those also maintained normal blood pressure without medication. So even though they hadn't been perfect with the diet, they had done well enough to not gain their fat back.
Hmm.
So one of the things we're going to be looking at is, how strict do people be to get the long-term results? Obviously, people that are sick may have to have a tighter window than people that are healthy. But what isn't acceptable is the people that gained their fat back got their blood pressure back.
Hmm.
Okay, so I don't know if that actually answers your question, but the people that keep the diet together enough to stay lean, were also able to get the clinical benefit, and they didn't do it with 100% compliance, but
Gotcha. Gotcha. Yeah, I asked you this one last time as well, but for people that are new, would you describe what is going on in the body when you fast, to the best of your
It's
knowledge?
really interesting. And one of the things we did, I think, really well in the book, Can Fasting Save Your Life, is Dr. Myers, who's our PhD postdoc from Columbia University, has a fabulous skill of taking relatively complex physiology, but explaining it in a way that's understandable. So she does a good job of translating hardcore science into something that, a normal person can actually integrate without necessarily watering it down so much so it loses credibility.
Hmm.
And so that, as you can see in the book, she goes through a really nice detailed explanation of what's actually known, what's speculatively assumed, and what isn't known. And as you can see, there's a whole lot that's not known yet. There's a lot of speculation that's going on, talking about a lot of these topical areas, everything from autophagy to on down. But, a lot of that research is actually still in its early stages and or done in animal studies, which are not always completely transferable. So what we do know, though, about fasting, because it has been evaluated pretty well, is that there's stuff that goes up, there's stuff that goes down. There's a big change. The biggest problem, fundamental change associated with fasting is we change fuels. So
Hmm.
you're normally burning glucose. And interestingly enough, your biggest glucose burner is your brain. The human
Wow.
brain is our biggest burner of glucose, and it changes from burning glucose to burning a ketone byproduct called beta hydroxybutyric acid and BHB. So that becomes the fuel of the brain. If the brain couldn't do that, you couldn't fast very long. You could go maybe a week. Because the brain can do that, the average human male can fast 70 days before they enter starvation. So not that you should do that, but you
Hmm.
could do that. And so that conversion of the brain was so critical to human beings that all the humans in our past that couldn't do that, they all died.
Hmm.
That's what essentially a biological adaptation is. It was so critical to the survival of humans that all the humans that didn't have that little trick up their sleeve didn't make it. Because honestly, with a brain as big as ours, when spring comes late, you're in deep trouble. When there's nothing to eat, you got a problem. Because the brain can change to burning fat, we can go and do long-term fasting. And all we've done is taken this very ancient biological adaptation and applied it into a very modern situation. Think about it. For 200,000 years, humans lived on whole foods. That's it. And 200 years ago, with the Industrial Revolution, we started to transition to the use of ultra-processed foods. And now, as much as 70% of calories come from ultra-processed foods. And that's where our obesity and our visceral fat and all that comes from. And all we're doing is taking this ancient practice of fasting and applying it in a situation that never existed before. And that's where people had access to ultra-processed foods and could fool their brains and get fat. There was no fat people in the world of our ancient ancestors, just like there's no fat animals living in nature. Even whales are only 9% body fat. They're lean, mean machines. They just happen to wear their fat on the outside of their body.
Hmm.
But so the point is this overweight obesity stuff. In fact, it used to be the only people that got these diseases that we're talking about were people called kings. It was the kings that got the gout and got the heart disease because they were the only ones that could afford to eat the highly processed foods or excessively eat consistently enough to get fat and develop the diseases of kings. Now everybody, 74% of people in industrialized countries are now overweight or obese. If you're not fat, you are abnormal.
Hmm.
Even in our a generation ago, you go to school, there might be one child that was overweight. And now there might be one child that's not overweight. And that's the one they'll call child services on because their mother's a vegan.
Hmm. Hmm. Crazy. Absolutely crazy. You also, I've heard you talk about this quite a bit, that basically the same thing that is going on in the body when you fast also goes on during exercise. In the
Yes.
broader opinion is that you are, in both instances, you are undoing dietary excess, is kind of your thinking on it.
Well, so exercise and fasting both undo the consequence of dietary excess, both mobilize fat, both mobilize visceral fat. So it's not surprising to find out, even though they're very different activities, some of the benefits are going to be the same. And for example, rats, if you take rats these are genetically bred rats, and you divide them into two camps, and half of they're fed exactly the same, everything's the same, except you give half the rats a wheel. The rats with the wheel will exercise. They'll run on that wheel. They'll do that. And the rats in the cages that are given the wheel don't get Alzheimer's disease.
Mm.
And they said, why? What is it about exercise that prevents Alzheimer's disease? And what they found out was the rats that exercise have massively higher BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, that protects the brain from oxidative damage from their digestion of their diet. And so the other thing that increases BDNF is fasting. And so if you take rats, for example, and you systematically underfeed them, or you periodically fast them, they live twice as long as rats that are fed ad libitum. Now, we have a society where people are eating ad libitum, and they're dying prematurely. They're aging out prematurely as a consequence of it. If you just stop that and shift from the foods that we've eating in the last 200 years to the foods we ate for 200,000 years, the whole foods, guess what? You slow down the aging process. I see it every time I go in the gym and play basketball. I'm 65. I'm playing with guys at least 20 years or 30 years younger. And yet they're already aging out. All
Mhm.
kinds of repetitive injuries and tendonitis. They have aerobic capacity issues. They're aging out right before your eyes there. And these are, athletes. These are people willing to
Yeah.
play basketball. They're not sitting at home watching other people play. That's what we do now. A lot of people don't exercise at all. They hire other people to exercise for them. It's called the NFL.
Yeah.
And they sit in overstuffed chairs drinking high caloric beverages, pretending to be part of the winning coalition. But I'm talking about even guys that are exercising and making an effort to get out there are still, you see them age out because of their diet.
Yeah.
Exercise is not enough to stem the aging process. It takes exercise, it takes sleep, good quality sleep, and it takes diet. And it turns out that diet may be the largest effect size in terms of the things you can do to affect that premature aging process. And
Mm.
so, you know, as people reach their 60s, their 70s, their 80s, it really becomes apparent. Then they start getting cognitive decline or other problems if they're aging out too quickly. You can see it in smokers. People that smoke cigarettes bathe themselves with free radicals. And that's why they get smoker's face. You know, the premature aging look, you can tell if somebody's a heavy smoker, the changes in their voice. These are basically free radicals causing cross-linked collagen tissues. It's just a facilitated aging process. You will, of course, you'll wrinkle up and get old. Everybody gets old, but you do it much quicker if you smoke. So you
Hmm.
can see a person that's a smoker that looks like they're in their 70s or 80s, but they might only be in their 50s because of the effect of this free radicals. Well, if you bathe yourself with antioxidants like fruits and vegetables and all the whole plant food type things, then you have some protection against the natural consequences of aging. So you'll still age out, but you'll do it much slower. And that's why do you think people NBA, they're 38 years old and they're saying, "Oh my God, it's amazing. He's still playing despite
Yeah.
being 38 years old." They still have the skill sets, but they can't recover from the injuries as quickly
Mm.
because of this aging process. And you'll notice some of the people that manage to keep active in high-level athletic sports are often very careful about what they put in their body and their health habits. The ones that live fast tend to go out fast. The ones that
Mhm.
tend to hang out oftentimes are quite conscientious about their habits, their diet habits, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. The interesting point there I wanted to piggyback on a bit is you mentioned skin changes, and I noticed in the book you had a few cases, psoriasis being one, and then I believe a skin cancer case. And I'd love for you to touch on that because I think still today, most people don't think like skin issues are really healable. It's like,
Right.
you get
Well,
your skin checkup, you go get it removed, and like it has nothing to do with your diet and
right.
lifestyle. So would you touch
Well,
on
that's
some
what
of what
almost
you've seen?
everybody thinks. In fact, if you look in Can Fasting Save Your Life, you'll see a case of plaque psoriasis. This gentleman had 22-year history with plaque psoriasis.
Wow.
So not just a weekend.
Mm,
And we put him on a fast. I think it was 13 days of fasting, and you can see the pictures there and the changes and the follow-up. And of course, the problem is you still have to get people to eat healthy, in order to maintain the results. But he and hundreds of others that we've treated have done fabulously well with nothing but willingness to clean up the diet and the lifestyle. And so it's nice that we're now able to start publishing these in peer-reviewed journals because, as you said, most people think, oh, diet doesn't have anything to do with it. And many of
yeah,
the times their doctors will tell them, oh, no, that's just quackery. Diet doesn't matter. You eat whatever you want to eat. Doesn't matter what you
exactly.
put in your mouth. I wonder if you went to an auto mechanic and he said, oh, don't you worry. You put any liquid you want in your car. It'll run just fine on anything. As long as it fits in the tank, it'll be fine. We would laugh.
Hmm.
We think, oh, wait a second. No, no, no. I remember a farmer when I was in Australia doing my osteopathic training, and he brought me in his little girl who had whole body psoriasis, and really suffering with it, and wasn't responsive to steroids. And I said, okay, look, we have to change the diet. And he was like, what do you mean? She's on a normal diet. And I said, no, we need to pull the dairy products, the glutinous grains, and the sugar. And he said, well, why would we have to do that? I said, well, would you feed your animals the dairy products, the sugar, and these products? And he goes, well, of course not. Don't be an idiot. They
Yeah.
die.
Yeah.
And I said, well, so you feed your animals very carefully regulated diets, right? Yeah. Well, but he was thinking, well, people aren't animals, so we can eat whatever we want.
Hmm.
So he changed the diet and had, fabulous outcome. But what was fascinating to me was when he brought the girl in to show me that things had gotten so much better, he brought his son in, who was a little bit older, who had chronic sinusitis and some asthma problems. And he goes, what about this one? And I said, well, I'm surprised it hasn't started to improve with the diet. And he said, oh, no, I didn't change the diet in that one. I thought this was just for psoriasis.
Hmm.
And so, I hadn't made it really clear that, and then he started realizing, oh my gosh, that means he has to change his diet too. So the implications are, broad and far-fetched.
Yeah.
It's so difficult for people to adopt healthy diets. But if you do, conditions like asthma, eczema, psoriasis, rheumatoid arthritis, ulcerative colitis, ankylosing spondylitis, these conditions do respond, and oftentimes profoundly. And that's why we're trying to publish these articles and publish this book, so we can document it, so people can overcome their well-intentioned but misguided doctors that are telling them, oh no, eat whatever they want.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that is something with my personal story. I went whole food plant based, and why I started this show is because just that change. Forget about fasting. It was just the whole food plant based aspect where my asthma that I had had since I was 3 years old gone within months. Right,
Right.
couldn't believe it, and that was a big spark to everything I've done since. But also skin issues. That I blamed on being an athlete and sweaty stuff on my skin that I just are non-existent anymore.
Right.
And those are the ones like I get pushback on, because people don't think those things can change.
Right. Well, it's hard to argue with the pictures and the published data.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? It's like,
for sure. That's why what you're doing is so important.
yeah,
Like it's incredible
because
work.
listen, most people are not going to do this. Most people are not going to do what you did. But at
Mhm.
least the people that are willing to do it should have the right to know, so they can decide to do it or not do it. I mean, I understand people don't want to go on whole food diets. They don't want to exercise. They don't want to get enough sleep. They don't want to give up their short-term pleasure-seeking self-indulgent behavior. I got it. I understand it.
Yeah,
But there are some people that if they knew it, they would have done it.
exactly.
And that's tragic when a person's not even given the option or the knowledge. If they have the option, they choose not to do it. Like I said, I completely understand. And
Yeah,
most people aren't going to do it till they're driven by pain, debility, and fear of death.
yeah,
That's what the best motivating factors are for people. And, that's why a lot of the people we work with tend to be older, because that's when the pain shows up. But the
right.
people that get the most benefit are the younger people. Because if
Mhm.
you do even a reasonable job when you're younger, you don't have to deal with the serious problems when you're older. And, when you think about it, well, they say, oh, well, when I'm old, I don't care. But, if let's say you live from 50 to 80, that's 30 years. Those 30 years could be the best years of your life, or they could be the worst years of your life. And you say, what if you said 20 to 50? You say, well, I don't care about those years from 20 to 50. Well, that's just how you're going to feel until
Yeah,
and
exactly.
so there's as much time later in life, if you're healthy, as there is in younger, where people are, thinking about this stuff. So, but you become more vulnerable as you age. And
Mhm.
so starting younger, even if you're not perfect, even if you're not getting headaches from your halo being too tight, just starting, not smoking, not using drugs like alcohol and other things that cause so much devastating side effects, not eating an animal-rich, highly processed food diet, will make huge differences to the rate with which you age out, your functional capacities early on, and maybe even more importantly, you don't have to spend the last 20 years of your life unable to talk or move, lying in some nursing home bed waiting for people to change your diaper because you stroked out or had a heart attack that would have been and could have been preventable.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. That's a good lead into heart disease, which I want to ask you, and maybe a pre question to that, because I noticed that one of the cases in the book around heart disease was somebody who it was not advised for him to fast, I believe. So I'm curious, like, who is fasting potentially not for when somebody comes
Right.
in and you say, hey, we shouldn't fast this person? Like, what are you looking at and why is that the case?
Right. So most of the time it's because of their medical treatment. If they've had a heart attack, a stroke, a PE, atrial fibrillation, they're likely on anticoagulant therapy. Those drugs are dangerous to discontinue rapidly. You have to be really careful about weaning them down because they can cause a stroke.
Okay.
So we don't want to have a person have a stroke and create more problems than we're solving. So if you're on those meds, we do modified fasting so you can continue the medication and go through a very careful, gradual wean down. It can take as long as a year to get people off some of these medications.
Mm,
So people that are on drugs, or they have such bad kidney disease, their kidneys wouldn't hold up to the detoxifying effect of fasting. Or they have a fear of fasting. They're too anxious. They're not able to handle it. Because let's see, fasting can be an intense and rather miserable process, especially if you don't prepare properly for it.
Hmm.
So you have to have people willing to go through the transition to fasting, give up their addictions. They have to be willing to quit smoking, drinking. We have to get them off their drugs safely. Once you do that and you prep well, fasting generally goes well. Listen, we've done it 25,000 times in
Yeah.
patients. And a lot of these people are older and have significant health problems. And so far, everybody that's walked in has walked out.
Mm.
And so we're working really hard to preserve our safety data. We don't fast people unless we think they're going to have a good outcome. We'll do
Right.
some other approach. We'll get them their diet advice. We'll do a juice fast, whatever. But we do water fasting in people that we believe have a reasonable chance of not only surviving, but thriving and
Yeah.
having good outcome. Now, in the case of blood pressure, it's one of the best studied conditions we have. We did initially a study with 174 consecutive people with hypertension, and 174 people lowered their pressure enough to eliminate medication. We have the largest effects that have ever been shown in treating hypertension, with an average drop of 60 points in systolic blood pressure in stage 3
Wow.
hypertensives. And in a study we just did with our colleagues from the Mayo Clinic, we did a prospective study. And of the 27 people that completed the study, 26 had completely normal blood pressure without medication at 6-week follow-up. At 1 year, over 60% of the people still had normal pressure without meds, and 76% of the people had maintained weight loss, despite the fact that, that was an issue before they fasted. So we know that blood pressure is a responsive condition. Almost all essential hypertension appears to respond to this approach. There is other kinds of hypertension, secondary hypertension, where you've got a pheochromocytoma, or you've got some other kidney disease that might be a problem. But for the majority of hypertensive patients, they can achieve normal blood pressure and without medications. And once you get rid of the medications, you get rid of the chronic cough, fatigue, the impotence, and the premature death that comes from the drugs. People also don't know that the drugs don't reduce your risk of a heart attack. They do reduce your risk slightly of stroke, and that's the reason they justify it. But people are just as likely to have a heart attack whether they're taking their blood pressure medications or not. And that's not generally recognized, but it's well accepted. And
Mm.
so you can't think that just because I'm taking the drugs, now I'm protected. You're not. The only thing that really protects you is getting well. And that's diet, sleep, and exercise, because those are the things that actually make a difference. That's the stuff that really works.
Mm. Amazing. Amazing. Yeah, you also had the melanoma.
Yeah.
I think it was melanoma case. And you had mentioned last time we did this, there was an opportunity to do studies with melanoma because of the standard of care associated with
Right.
that. Is
Well,
that,
we
can you
have a
speak on?
melanoma example. Does T. Colin Campbell, who wrote the introduction to the book's wife,
Yeah.
does with melanoma, and he tells her story, and here she is, now it's 20 years later and still doing
Yeah.
well. But actually, it was lymphoma. It was follicular
Lymphoma. I'm sorry.
lymphoma.
Yeah.
And so the very first paper we published on lymphoma was a case report of a 42-year-old woman who'd had a 2-year history of progressive follicular lymphoma, and she'd been confirmed with excisional biopsy. It was well worked up. But her doctor and ultimately her oncologist told her that diet didn't matter. She could eat whatever she wanted. The diet was not related to lymphoma. And that fasting, when she asked them about fasting, they said that it was criminal quackery.
Hmm.
And so even though she wasn't really encouraged by them, she decided to come to TrueNorth Health. She underwent fasting for 21 days and her tumors disappeared.
Mm.
And we sent her back to the oncologist with instructions to get a follow-up CT scan because we wanted to objectify it. And we told her they might give her a little trouble about that. But she goes back in and he's like examining her and he can't find any of the tumors because they're gone. And he finally said to her, "What happened?" And she said, "I went to the criminal quacks and I did the fasting and the tumors all went away." And he was like, "Oh, well, that's amazing." So anyway, we tracked her for a year. And at a year, whole body CT, cancer free, doing great. And so we submitted this paper to the British Medical Journal. And we talk about it in the book. The articles are available to anybody that wants to read any of our studies. They can go to our website at truenorthhealth.com. They're all available. And they said, "Look, why don't you track her for 3 years? Because under conventional treatment, sometimes tumors go down with chemotherapy, but then they come back. And the chemotherapy doesn't actually make people live longer. And as a consequence, it wasn't considered unethical to get her well."
Mm.
Whereas if you're treating something where there's a standard of care that's accepted, it would be unethical. They would never publish the case report, because to
Right.
deny somebody some whatever conventional treatment for this unproven treatment would be experimental. So in this case, they decided it wasn't unethical. They went ahead and published the study. At 3 years, we tracked her down and we told her, listen, you have to stick to this diet or it could be fatal, because I'll track you down and kill you. And she believed me. So she stuck to the diet. At 3 years, she was cancer-free. We sent in the article to the British Medical Journal. And interestingly enough, first they rejected it because
Hmm.
one of the reviewers said, oh, she probably just got lucky. And then we appealed and they did publish it. And then we tracked her at 10 years. And at 10 years, she continues to be cancer-free and she continues to do well with the diet and lifestyle. So, but since she went public with her story and that paper was published, we've gotten many lymphoma patients, a couple dozen patients that we're tracking. And we just got published a case series of lymphoma patients, including some more serious cases where there actually had already been metastasis to the bone and whatnot. And they've
Wow.
also done well. And we've gotten some long-term follow-ups. And so that case series has now been published. It'll be coming out, I believe, this month. And so
Wow.
that's what you do before running a clinical trial. And so what we're hoping to do is a clinical trial. People will be randomly assigned to the condition, and we'll get a chance to see what works better, getting people to well or keeping them sick. And, look at the long-term outcomes of that difference. So at least in the case of lymphoma, we've got good evidence that at least some people are able to do very well with these radical interventions like fasting, diet, exercise, and adequate sleep.
Yeah, that is so exciting. That's awesome, and I'll be sure to follow that. And that particular case is just 21 days, 3 weeks of fasting,
That was
in which
21 days of fasting. Now, the subsequent ones, though, we did have one was 39 days. So we
okay.
did do some longer fasts and other people. But I've
I mean,
also had
it's
some shorter that have done well with shorter
yeah.
too. So
I mean,
the duration of fasting isn't specific to the condition, it's specific to the patient.
yeah, sure. But it's just wild to think, because when you go down the chemotherapy route, for example, right? I don't even know how long the process is, but it's long, it's expensive, it's brutal. To think that you have this other option where, in most cases, it's around 30 days, where you just, take
Well,
December off, you know.
yeah, the more
Um,
important issue to raise, and should always be asked of your oncologist if you're facing a cancer diagnosis, is where's the evidence that
mm,
if I do this chemotherapy, I'm going to live longer or better?
mm,
Because if you read the Pulitzer Prize winning book, The Emperor of All Maladies by Mukherjee, who's a Harvard oncologist, kind of guy, it makes a pretty compelling case that at least in many forms of cancer, the treatment doesn't actually been shown to make people live longer or better. And so, if you're going to go through the ravaging effects of chemotherapy, you certainly want to hope that at least there's some potential benefit. Now, they
mm,
are coming up with new therapies like immunotherapies, which are designed to try to stimulate the body to attack the cancer rather than just kill everything. And where those are applicable, maybe they have good utility. Certainly, fasting is not going to solve everything.
mm.
And a lot of the research is about fasting in conjunction with chemotherapy. Valter Longo showed that, like, if you take 30 rats with cancer, again, genetically bred rats, and you give them enough chemotherapy to kill all the cancer cells, all the rats die from the toxicity of chemotherapy. If you don't give them enough, then the cancer comes back. But if you take the same rats with the same cancer and the same chemotherapy, but you fast them before and after treatment, he found all 30 rats survive, dramatically increasing cancer-free survival because of something called differential stress sensitivity. The idea is that cancer cells are more vulnerable to a ketogenic environment because they have a high metabolic rate. So you put them in a ketogenic environment, they can't fight as well. And so the immune system can get them and chemotherapy can get them. And also fasting helps protect healthy cells from the ravaging effects of chemotherapy. And the moment he published that paper, pharmaceutical companies went, wait a second, this can help our drugs work better and it might help minimize some of the damage. That's when fasting went from criminal quackery to cutting edge research.
Yeah,
And now they're desperately trying to come up with a way to make money on it by developing what are called fasting mimicking drugs. So drugs that would do to your body what fasting does, but in a form that they could sell in a pill.
right.
And without that nasty fasting where you have to
Yeah, right.
rest,
Yeah, yeah,
go
you
through
don't
all
want to
that.
do that.
No. But it has changed the discussion. So now fasting isn't seen quite as crazy as it was. Like I've been doing this for 40 years. I mean, they thought I was like, Jim Jones's protege or something.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, there's also the Longo also does the fasting mimicking diet as well,
Yes.
right? Which is kind of a
Well, he
similar.
monetized fasting by developing Prolon. And you went from no medical office in the country talking about fasting. Now there's 10,000 offices selling Prolon.
Yeah.
So, it's really changed the discussion.
Mm.
And of course, it's very appealing because they say, well, take the Prolon 5 days a month and then eat whatever you want the rest of the time. There's no changing your diet or anything. So, but just not eating crap 15% of the time, which is what 5 days of the month is enough to start generating some improvement with people.
Mm. Yeah, that's awesome. You had mentioned prior to us getting on some interesting COVID cases. Could you
Well,
get into that
during
a little
this
bit?
epidemic, we've been seeing, a lot of people that have suffered, not just suffered with COVID, which generally wasn't that big of a problem, but the people that would not recover, so long COVID. So
Hmm.
they had COVID, but they didn't recover. And we've also been seeing people come in that didn't necessarily have COVID, but they got vaccinated for COVID and then develop serious reactions to their treatment, especially healthcare workers that were getting multiple boosters and whatnot. It oftentimes seemed to activate their underlying autoimmune disease and activate people that had history with cancer and other problems. So, not sure exactly what's going on there, but the idea is these people are coming in with long COVID or COVID vaccine injury, and we've taken them and fasted them. We just published our first outcome with long COVID. This person had suffered absolute misery for 2 years with the brain fog, the fatigue, the joint pain, all that stuff. And we did a fast. It was actually 14 days and had dramatic results, long-term follow-up. And we got that paper published, I was kind of amazed they were willing to publish it. But anyway, so it's out there. And we had a lot of patients now that have suffered with these difficulties that seem to be doing well with fasting. Very similar to the response we see in autoimmune disease. And it may be that there's something about this exposure to this particular virus that activates that. It doesn't seem to like cause rheumatoid arthritis in people that didn't have rheumatoid arthritis, but people that had that history and it was quiescent, and then they get sick or they get vaccinated, and then all of a sudden it's rears its ugly head. And so we can quiet that back down with the fasting. And then the other thing we did that I find really exciting, and this paper was just accepted for publication, literally just a week ago. And this was a vegan, so long-standing vegan, very health aware person, but
Hmm.
had been, wasn't eating animal foods, but was getting into a little bit of the junk food, the junk vegan food.
Yeah.
And so he'd gained some weight, blood pressure had gone up a bit. And so he decided to come in and fast to kind of get the weight and the blood pressure back under control. And he asked me about lipoprotein little a, because it turns out lipoprotein little a is a marker that was thought to be genetically mediated. It's a very sensitive for predicting risk for cardiovascular disease. But Medicare will only let you take one of those tests because it's not thought to be changeable. There's no drug that'll lower it. There's no treatment. So they'll let you test for it, but there's no follow-up testing. Because what's the point of testing for something that can't change? And he said he wanted to do a follow-up. And I said, well, that's fine if you want to do that, but it's not going to change because this is supposed to be genetically mediated. But he didn't like the idea that he was considered high risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So anyway, we fasted him for 10 days and his blood pressure dropped beautifully. His weight came down. He felt fabulous. We waited and went back to the same lab, used exactly the same testing issues. And it turned out his lipoprotein went from very high at 240 down to normal, 40% reduction after 10 days of fasting.
Wow.
And so now we've been testing it in other people and finding out, guess what? It may not be treatable with drugs, but it appears to be treatable with fasting and dietary change. So we're going to actually do a longer term study now trying to evaluate this, but it's particularly great because there's no drugs or pills or potions that seems to be effective at affecting it, whereas fasting and diet apparently does. So I'm really excited about that. It's going to piss a lot of people off. I'll have a lot of fun with that. And
I love
and
it.
again, we're fortunate that we've been able to get these published in peer-reviewed journals, because in the past it would have been very difficult. These are so radical, these ideas of fasting and diet. Now they're becoming a little bit more acceptable, I think in large part because of the work that Walter Longo and others have done.
Yeah.
He also came out with a book that was on fasting, and he said in the book not to do the long-term fasting that we do, because he felt it was too dangerous. But he did have one caveat. He said, unless you do it at the TrueNorth Health Center. Now, since I evaluate other researchers' intelligence based on how much they agree with me, I consider him a genius.
I love it. I love it. That's a good, I think that's a good lead in, and maybe something we can wrap up with here. Is so for people at home, again, relatively healthy people, maybe, or average people that maybe
Yes.
are on blood pressure medication of
Yes.
some kind, but generally relatively in
Right.
in good shape.
So I think that everybody should fast every day
Hmm.
for 12 to 16 hours. And that if you eat a whole plant food diet free of salt, oil, and sugar, you're likely to lose weight, normalize blood pressure, normalize blood sugar levels. If it turns out, though, despite your efforts, you don't get a quick enough response, or you're just having trouble making that change, that's where long-term medically supervised fasting may be appropriate. But whether you do that at a place like TrueNorth Health Center or you do it at home in conjunction with your local doctor, you still need to follow the same protocol, which is history, exam, and lab to make sure you're a good candidate,
Hmm.
that you rest when you fast so you avoid dehydration, and that you recover carefully so you avoid post-fasting edema or refeeding syndrome or something, that can be serious or fatal. So fasting needs to be done right if it's long-term fasting. You're not driving to work, you're not taking drugs or supplements, you're not doing stupid things that could get you into trouble. If you want to know how to do that, just read our book, Can Fasting Save Your Life? We also have doctors that work remotely so they can do telemedicine in conjunction with their local doctor. And that book not only will give the patient what they need, but it will also give the doctor they need to understand testing and what the issues really are around fasting. And it's written at a high enough level that most physicians are feeling quite positive about it once they actually look at the research and the data. They may not know anything about it, but their attitude can be shifted by the information that we've brought together.
Yeah, I love it. What is follow up to that? Would you consider a long-term fast where you should pay attention to all that stuff?
Well, anything over 16 hours a day, frankly, because even
Okay.
shorter term fasting, if you're not a good candidate, if you're on medications, if you have complications or issues that can arise, we want to avoid all that. It's rare. Most people do fine, no matter what they do, but there's enough people, and I get those calls every week now from people that,
Yeah.
well-intentioned, trying to do the right thing, but they've gotten themselves in a little bit of trouble because they had some complication they weren't thinking about.
Yeah.
So, but I think for people that read the book, they'll know everything they need to know to understand what to do, what not to do. That's why we wrote the book, so that our experience could be passed on for people in an efficient and an effective way. And that's where Can Fasting Save Your Life is really a useful tool.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. On the last one, and I'll let you go here. On the refeeding, let's say I've checked all the boxes. I'm going to do
Yes,
a 48-hour fast,
yes,
this weekend. How do I properly
right.
refeed?
So it takes half the length of the fast on average to recover. That
Okay.
means where you're really particularly carefully controlled. So, for example, a 40-day fast takes about 20 days of controlled refeeding. A 20-day
Mm.
fast takes about 10 days of controlled refeeding. A shorter fast, say a 4-day fast, would only take a couple days. Usually the first day is fresh fruit or vegetable juices without the fiber so that you can get the system fired back up without digestive challenges. And then we introduce raw fruits and vegetables and then steamed starchy vegetables. And you just increase caloric density slowly depending on how long the fast is. Now, obviously, some people have individual variation on that. They might, if they have ulcerative colitis, or maybe they can't eat salad material, we've got to use an alternative to that. But again, one of the things we offer people, which I think would be useful to your viewers, is if they will go to our website at truenorthhealth.com and complete the registration forms, we offer a no-cost phone conversation so that we can, one, help them determine are they a candidate for that kind of approach, two, maybe refer them to somebody, if it's not the TrueNorth Health Center, maybe somebody closer to them, or hook them up with the telemedicine doctors that can advise them in conjunction with their local doctor, and to give them good advice about, duration and what they can
Yeah.
expect. And we're happy to do that. It doesn't cost them anything. We really don't want people to have bad experiences with fasting. That's what makes fasting look bad. So if you're going to do it, we want you to have a good result. If you're not a good candidate, it doesn't mean there's not stuff you can do. You just got to be smart about it. And it may be a modified fast or something like Valter Longo offers through the Prolon. There's a lot of opportunities out there now, short of the long-term medically supervised fasting. But if you're going to do that, do it right.
Hmm. Awesome. Awesome. Alan, thank you so much. Thank you for all the work you do. I have gotten through about 90% of this. I have to finish it. I'm super excited. People can buy it just about anywhere, right?
Anywhere, any
Okay.
bookstore, Amazon.com, or at our TrueNorthHealth.com site. Anywhere you go, you'll find it.
Yeah, congrats. And I'm looking forward to continuing to follow your work and good luck with the upcoming TED Talk. Another thing for people listening to look out for.
Excellent.
And yeah, thank you so much for all you
Oh,
do.
it's my
You're
pleasure.
helping so
Thank you
many
for
people.
getting the word out.